Is it my fault? You need to trust us. We're family.
The day I changed the locks on my children and my life. You are told to give your children roots and wings. I did, but their roots had long ago begun to strangle my own, and their wings cast a shadow so vast I had forgotten the feeling of sun on my face. That is why this morning I hired a man to come and change the locks on my life. Because sometimes to save your own garden, you must be willing to uproot the most beloved and most invasive plants. The decision had been made, but the memories that cemented it still echoed in the quiet of my home. Last Tuesday, it was the study. For years, this house has served as a convenient satellite office, a free laundromat, and an unofficial pantry for my children, Leo and Jessica. They drift in and out on currents of their own making, leaving behind the faint wakes of their presence. Jessica's half-empty mug of herbal tea growing cold on the counter. Leo's blazer slung over the back of a dining chair, as if he intends to return in a moment, though it might be days. They have keys, of course. What mother denies her children keys to the home where they grew up? I had been in the garden, my hands deep in the cool soil, tending to the rose bushes my late husband, Arthur, had planted for our 25th anniversary. There is a peace in the dirt, a predictable honesty in the cycle of bloom and dormancy. When I came inside, wiping my hands on my apron, I heard Leo's voice. It wasn't coming from the living room where he usually took his calls, pacing back and forth with his wireless earpiece. It was coming from the study, Arthur's study. The door was ajar. I pushed it open, and the sight stopped the breath in my lungs. The room was a sanctuary, a place I had kept just as he left it 10 years ago. His leather-bound books on military history stood in their precise rows. The faint scent of old paper and his pipe tobacco still clung to the velvet curtains. But Leo had commandeered it. He had swept a section of Arthur's books to the floor to make room for his sleek silver laptop. The antique globe had been pushed into a corner, and Arthur's worn leather wingback chair was angled to catch the light from the window, creating a more impressive backdrop for Leo's video conference. He was mid-sentence, gesturing with one hand, his voice full of the smooth, practiced confidence he used on his clients. A complete synergy of brand values, he was saying, a phrase that meant absolutely nothing to me. He saw me standing in the doorway. He didn't falter. He simply raised his eyebrows, gave me a tiny, dismissive wave, as if I were an interruption he was tolerating, and turned back to the glowing screen. I was a ghost in my own husband's study, an apparition at the edge of my son's important life. I backed away, pulling the door gently shut, the click of the latch sounding unnaturally loud in the silent house. I stood in the hallway for a long time, listening to the muffled cadence of his voice. A stranger's voice, coming from a place that was supposed to be sacred. When he finally emerged an hour later, he was already on his phone again. "Great call," he said, breezing past me toward the kitchen. He opened the refrigerator, his back to me. "Anything for lunch, Mom? I'm starving." He never mentioned the study, not a word of apology for the intrusion, not a hint of acknowledgement that he had violated a space that was not his to claim. I said nothing. I made him a sandwich on the good bread I buy for myself, and he ate it while scrolling through his phone. Later, after he had gone, leaving his plate on the table, I went back into the study. I knelt on the floor and carefully picked up each book he had discarded, running my hand over the embossed titles, putting them back in their rightful order. I moved the chair back to its proper place, where it faced the window overlooking the garden. I sat in it, my fingers tracing the worn spots on the arms where Arthur's hands had rested for so many years, and felt a profound and chilling emptiness. It was the feeling of being erased, slowly, politely, one displaced book at a time. That was the constant hum beneath our family life, the sound of my own slow disappearance. The violation of Arthur's study was a physical trespass, an act of clear, visible disrespect. But the deeper erosion, the one that truly unsettled the foundations of my life, had been happening for years in the silent, invisible world of bank accounts and credit scores. My pension, the result of 40 years shelving books and fostering a love of reading in generations of children, had become a slush fund for their perpetual emergencies. Arthur and I had been careful people. We saved, we invested modestly, we lived within our means. We believed in rainy day funds. I just never imagined the rain would be my own children and that the storm would never end. Jessica's boutique was the grandest illusion. It arrived 6 months ago, not as a business plan, but as a theatrical performance in my living room. She sat on the ottoman, her knees practically touching mine, her eyes wide and shimmering with unshed tears. She painted a picture with her words, a lovely little shop with a French name, Le Papillon Chic, filled with silk scarves and artisanal jewelry. It was, she said, her one true passion, her chance to build something real, something that was hers. "The banks just don't see the vision, Mom," she'd whispered, her voice catching. "They see a young woman. They don't see the hard work. But they would if I had a co-signer, someone with a solid history, someone they respect." She looked at me then, a masterfully crafted expression of hope and desperation. "Your credit is perfect. Dad always said you were the rock." Invoking her father was a particularly cruel and effective stroke. Arthur had been so proud of our financial independence, our ability to stand on our own 2 feet. The thought that I could use that strength, his legacy, to give our daughter her own footing felt right. It felt like what he would have wanted. Against the quiet hum of my own better judgment, I said yes. At the bank, she was a blur of efficiency, placing documents in front of me, pointing with a perfectly manicured finger. "Sign here, Mom, and here." The loan officer, a young man who looked too young to be deciding anyone's financial future, smiled benignly. I felt a small, sharp prick of unease as I signed my name, binding my future to her dream. But then Jessica hugged me, burying her face in my shoulder, and whispered, "Thank you. You've just made my whole life possible." The unease dissolved into the warm, familiar glow of maternal love. For weeks, I heard nothing but exciting updates. She was sourcing suppliers, scouting locations, and building a social media presence. It all sounded very modern and impressive. Then, about a month ago, the mail came. It was a normal Tuesday, the usual collection of bills and catalogs. But in the pile was a thick window envelope from a credit card company addressed to Jessica. It should have gone to her flat across town, but she still used my address for certain things she deemed important. I placed it on the hall table where I always left her post. It sat there for 3 days. On the 4th day, I picked it up. I don't know why. A strange impulse, a feeling that something was out of place. The envelope wasn't sealed properly. The flap lifted with no resistance at all. I told myself I was just going to tuck it in securely. But my eyes caught a flash of red on the statement inside, the words "past due" visible through the window. My heart began to beat a little faster. Without making a conscious decision to do so, I pulled the papers from the envelope. It was a credit card statement, and the balance was astronomical. But that wasn't what seized my breath. At the top of the page, under recent payments, was a single large transaction. A payment in the exact amount of the bank loan I had co-signed. The money had never been for Les Papillons Chic. It had been a lifeline to pay off a debt. I scanned the list of charges below. There were no invoices for clothing racks or wholesale scarves. There were airline tickets to Indonesia, a week-long stay at a 5-star spa resort in Bali, charges from restaurants with names I couldn't pronounce, and tucked away near the bottom, a recurring monthly charge, small but steady, to something called City Self-Storage. The boutique was a ghost, a beautifully constructed lie designed to make me collateral for her holiday. I carefully folded the statement, slipped it back into the unsealed envelope, and placed it back on the hall table. I felt nothing, And then I felt everything. It wasn't about the money. It was the intricate, deliberate deception. She hadn't just asked for my help. She had written a script, cast me in a role, and directed me in a play where I was the only one who didn't know the ending. The warmth of her hug in the bank now felt like the cold, professional touch of a con artist. After the shock of Jessica's manufactured boutique, a different kind of theft began, one that was quieter and more intimate. It started with things so small, I convinced myself I was merely becoming forgetful. A small Meissen figurine of a bluebird, a gift from Arthur on our first anniversary, vanished from the mantelpiece. I searched for a week, checking behind cushions and in dusty corners, before concluding I must have broken it while cleaning and forgotten the incident entirely. Then, a pair of Arthur's silver cufflinks, the ones with his initials engraved in a scrolling script, disappeared from the small ceramic dish on his dresser, where they had rested for a decade. I chided myself for being careless, for not putting them somewhere safer. Each missing object left a tiny, hollow space, not just in my home, but in my confidence. It is a terrible thing to begin to suspect your own mind of betrayal. The world softens at the edges, and you start to question the solidity of your own memories. Was the bird ever really there? Did I move the cufflinks myself and simply cannot recall where? The house, once a fortress of familiarity, began to feel like a place of small, inexplicable tricks. The final straw was the teaspoons. They were a set of 12, sterling silver with a delicate rose pattern on the handle, a wedding gift from my mother. They weren't for daily use, they were for occasions, Christmas, birthdays, the rare afternoon I'd have an old friend over for tea and cake. They lived in a velvet-lined mahogany box in the top drawer of the dining room sideboard. I hadn't opened the box since Easter, but I was planning a small tea for a neighbor and went to get them out for a polish. The weight of the box felt wrong the moment I lifted it. It was too light. I set it on the dining table, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. I lifted the lid. The 12 silken indentations were there, perfectly formed to cradle each spoon. But they were all empty. Every single one. The sight was so stark, so utterly final, that I felt a wave of dizziness. This was not a misplaced item. This was an erasure. You do not misplace 12 spoons in a box. Leo was coming over that evening to, in his words, fix my Wi-Fi, which was his usual excuse to get a home-cooked meal. I waited until after he'd eaten, my heart thumping a nervous rhythm against my ribs. I hated the idea of an accusation. It felt ugly, contrary to everything a mother should be. "Leo, dear," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. "A strange thing has happened. I can't seem to find the silver teaspoons my mother gave me." He looked up from his phone, his expression one of mild distraction. "Which ones?" "The rose pattern ones, from the box in the sideboard." He shrugged, a gesture of effortless dismissal. "They'll turn up, Mum. You're always putting things in safe places and forgetting where." He gave me a small, placating smile. "No, this is different," I insisted, my voice rising slightly. "The box is there, but the spoons are gone, all of them." He finally put his phone down and leaned forward, adopting a tone of deep, practiced concern that set my teeth on edge. "Are you sure you didn't move them? Sometimes, when you're tidying up..." He let the sentence hang in the air. The implication was clear. He glanced around the room as if expecting to see them sitting in a flower pot. "I have not touched them since Easter, Leo." "I know I haven't," he sighed, a long, theatrical exhalation of patience. He reached across the table and patted my hand. His skin was warm. As he pulled his hand back, I saw it. On his wrist was a watch I had never seen before. It was heavy, with a dark blue face and a thick, gleaming stainless steel band. It looked expensive. It looked new. He caught my glance and instinctively pulled his cuff down over it. "Look, Mum," he said softly, his voice dropping into a therapeutic register. I'm not saying you're losing it, but you have been a bit scattered lately. Remember last week when you couldn't find your reading glasses and they were on your head? He was smiling, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a doctor placating a difficult patient. He was rewriting reality, and he was doing it so smoothly, so lovingly, that for a terrifying moment, I almost believed him. The memory of the glasses was true. Was this the same? Had I taken the spoons out, one by one, and hidden them around the house in a fit of nonsensical tidying? The certainty I had felt just moments before began to fray. A cold fog of doubt rolled in. He was my son. He was worried about me. He was just trying to help, wasn't he? I nodded slowly, unable to meet his gaze. "Perhaps you're right," I murmured. "Perhaps I've just forgotten." "Exactly," he said, his voice bright with relief. He picked up his phone again, the crisis averted. "They'll show up, don't you worry." But I was worried. As I cleared his plate, I looked at the empty mahogany box still sitting on the dining table. Then I thought of the quick, almost imperceptible movement of his cuff, hiding the new, gleaming watch on his wrist. I was worried that my memory wasn't the problem at all. I was worried that it was perfectly clear. The catalyst arrived not with a bang, but with a tinny, disembodied voice from a small gray cylinder on the bookshelf. Jessica had given me the Bluetooth speaker for my birthday, a device I barely understood. "So you can listen to your audiobooks from anywhere in the house, Mom," she'd said, pairing it with her phone to demonstrate. She'd left in a hurry that day and had apparently forgotten to disconnect. I was in the sunroom, misting the leaves of my orchids, when her voice suddenly crackled to life, startling me so much I nearly dropped the spray bottle. "Are you there? Can you hear me?" For a moment, I was utterly confused. I looked around the empty room. Then I heard Leo's voice, equally metallic, respond, loud and clear. "What's the emergency now?" They were on the phone, and for some reason their conversation was being broadcast into my quiet afternoon. I should have turned it off. I should have called out, let them know I could hear. But I was frozen, standing motionless as their words began to fill the air. "It's the car," Leo said, his voice a familiar performance of weary exasperation. "The transmission is shot. The mechanic basically said it would cost more to fix than it's worth." "So get a new one," Jessica replied, her tone breezy. "With what, Jess? Fairy dust? I'm in a bit of a hole after, A pause. Then Jessica's voice, lower now, conspiratorial. "Well, there's always the bank of Mum. She's been quiet lately. It's probably time for a withdrawal." The water bottle slipped from my fingers and landed with a soft thud on the Persian rug. I didn't bend to pick it up. My blood ran cold, a sudden icy shock that started in my chest and spread to my fingertips. The bank of Mum. Is that what I was to them? Not a person, not their mother, but an institution, a resource. "I tried to soften her up the other night," Leo was saying, "but she was in a mood about some old spoons. Honestly, I think she's starting to lose it." Jessica laughed, a short, sharp sound devoid of any real humor. "Oh God, the spoons. Did you get anything good for them?" The room began to tilt. The sunlight slanting through the windows seemed unnaturally bright. The dust motes dancing in its beams suddenly sharp and distinct. I gripped the back of a wicker chair to steady myself. My spoons. My mother's spoons. "Paid for this?" Leo said, and I could almost hear the smug satisfaction in his voice. "The watch you liked almost covered the whole thing. The old boy at the pawn shop said it was good silver." The watch, the heavy, gleaming watch on his wrist. The lie he told with his gentle, concerned eyes. It all clicked into place. The tumblers of a lock I hadn't even known was there, turning with a sickening finality. He had sat at my table, wearing the proceeds of a theft from my home, and patiently explained to me that my own mind was failing. "Perfect," Jessica said. "So what's the plan for the car?" "Another boutique? Nah, can't play that card twice," Leo mused. "I'm thinking something more direct. A cosign on a car loan. I'll do the whole I can't get ahead without reliable transportation speech. You can come for backup, do the teary-eyed thing about how you worry about me driving that death trap. Well, corner the old dear after Sunday dinner. She's always softer then. The coldness in my veins was turning to something else, something hard and hot, like metal being forged. The fog of self-doubt that had clouded my mind for months was burned away in that single, searing moment of clarity. I wasn't forgetful. I wasn't careless. I was being managed. I was being played. The ghost in my own kitchen, the silent benefactor, the slightly senile old dear whose only remaining purpose was to fund their lives. She'll fold, Jessica said with absolute certainty. She always does. I reached out a trembling hand and picked up the water bottle. My reflection was distorted in a droplet on the green plastic, a stranger with wide, stunned eyes. Their voices continued to chatter from the speaker, planning the logistics of their next emotional ambush. But I was no longer listening to the words. I was listening to the truth beneath them. The truth of what I had become to them, and the truth of what I had allowed myself to be. The love I had poured into them my entire life had not filled them up. It had only taught them that I was a well with no bottom. That afternoon, listening to the casual cruelty of the children I had raised, I finally found the bottom, and it was made of stone. After the voices from the speaker fell silent, the house seemed to hum with the residue of their conversation. The air was thick with it, a poison I could feel on my skin. I did not want to be in the sunroom, not in the kitchen, not in any of the spaces they had so easily contaminated. I needed air, or the opposite of it. I needed a place where the past was solid, where facts were recorded and could be trusted. I went to the attic. The pull-down stairs groaned under my weight, a familiar complaint. The air up here was still and warm, smelling of cedar and thyme. Shafts of dusty sunlight cut through the gloom from a single round window at the far end. In the corner, behind a stack of Arthur's old university textbooks, was a small fireproof safe. Arthur had been an accountant before he retired, a man who believed in order, in columns of figures that balanced, in a world where every debit had a corresponding credit. "A ledger tells a story, Clara," he used to say, tapping a page with his fountain pen, "and the numbers never lie." I worked the combination, my fingers sure and steady despite the tremor in my hands. Inside were our old tax returns, the deed to the house, and what I was looking for, a stack of 3 heavy leather-bound ledgers. I carried one downstairs. It was cool and solid in my hands, a reassuring weight. I set it on the dining room table, next to the empty mahogany box that had held my mother's spoons. I opened it. Arthur's handwriting, a neat, slightly back-slanted cursive, filled the pages. Mortgage payments, car insurance, household expenses, all meticulously recorded by date, description, and amount. It was the story of our life together, told in the quiet language of responsibility. I ran my fingers over the columns, a history of prudence and partnership. Then I turned to the first blank page at the back of the book. I took out the good fountain pen from the study, the one Arthur had used, and a bottle of black ink. My own handwriting was rounder than his, the hand of a librarian, not an accountant, but it was just as clear. At the top of the page, I wrote a single heading, "Debts Owed." I started with the largest and most recent wound, June 4th. Co-signed loan for Jessica's boutique, amount £20,000. Premise, false. I wrote it all down, the cold facts of the deception. The money hadn't gone to suppliers. It had gone to a credit card company to pay for a holiday in Bali. The pen seemed to move of its own accord then, dredging up years of smaller transgressions, the death by 1,000 cuts that I had willfully ignored. Leo, March 12th, emergency car repair, $850, never repaid. Jessica, January 8th, deposit for new flat, £1,500, a loan that was never mentioned again. Leo, last Christmas, to cover a gap until a client pays, $1,000. He'd shown up a week later with a new phone that cost at least that much. On and on it went, a litany of their crises and my compliance. Each entry was a small anchor pulling me down, but together they formed a chain that was finally pulling me up out of the murky water of denial. I created a second column, items taken. At the top of the list, I wrote 12 sterling silver teaspoons, rose pattern. I didn't know their exact monetary value, but I knew what they were worth. Pawned by Leo for a watch. I added that detail, my pen scratching angrily on the page. I listed Arthur's cufflinks, the Meissen bluebird, a small gold locket of my grandmother's I hadn't been able to find for a year. I was an archaeologist of my own life, cataloging the artifacts of their pillaging. As I wrote, a detail from Jessica's credit card statement surfaced in my mind, the one I'd almost dismissed as unimportant. City self-storage, recurring monthly payment. It seemed so out of place amongst the Balinese spas and expensive restaurants. Why would she need a storage unit? Her flat was small but hardly overflowing. What was she hiding? It was another thread, another piece that didn't fit the picture she so carefully curated. I made a note of it at the bottom of the page, a question mark beside it. When I finished, I put the pen down and looked at the page. It was a brutal document. The story it told was not one of a loving mother helping her struggling children. It was the story of an ecosystem that had fallen out of balance, of 2 thriving predators and a single dwindling resource. The numbers didn't whisper about my failing memory or my tendency to misplace things. They screamed a story of methodical, sustained exploitation. The grief I felt was profound, a deep, hollow ache for the children I thought I had, for the family I had pretended we were. But for the first time, the grief was not the dominant emotion. Beneath it, a foundation of cold, hard anger was settling into place. The old deer they planned to corner after Sunday dinner was gone. In her place sat a woman with a ledger, a fountain pen, and a perfectly clear memory. Arthur was right. The numbers never lied. And now, finally, I was ready to listen to the story they told. The ledger was a record of the past, written in the steady hand of yesterday's grief. But the bleeding was happening now, in the silent, instantaneous world of clicks and taps I didn't understand. My children were fluent in a language I couldn't speak, and they were using it to write checks on my life. My own ignorance had become their accomplice. It was time to learn the language of my enemy. My grandnephew, Alex, was my only choice. He was my sister's grandson, a clever, quiet boy studying computer science at university. He was distant enough from the central blast zone of my family to be safe, and he had always treated me with a gentle respect that felt alien coming from anyone under the age of 30. I called him on the landline, my voice practiced and light. "Alex, dear, it's your Aunt Clara. I was wondering if I might impose on you. I'm feeling rather prehistoric with this laptop of mine, and I thought perhaps you could give your old aunt a lesson or two." He agreed immediately, his voice warm and genuine. "Of course, Aunt Clara. I can come by Saturday afternoon. We'll have you surfing the web in no time." He arrived on Saturday with a patient smile and a box of biscuits. He sat beside me at the dining table, where Arthur's computer now lived, and didn't once make me feel foolish for my fumbling questions. He had the calm temperament of a good teacher, explaining things in simple analogies I could grasp. A password was a key to a specific door. A browser was a car that drove you around the internet. A bookmark was a finger holding your place in a book. I listened, I nodded, and I steered him gently toward the harbor I needed to reach. "The bank keeps sending me letters about going paperless," I said, a carefully planted falsehood. "I suppose I ought to learn how to check my statements online." "That's a great idea," he said enthusiastically. "It's much more secure, and you can see transactions the moment they happen." He guided me through the process, his long fingers flying over the keyboard, showing me how to log in with the multi-step security I'd always found so intimidating. And then, there it was, my financial life laid bare on the glowing screen. It was overwhelming, a long, scrolling list of names and numbers. "See," Alex said, pointing, "each one is a different transaction. the date, the vendor, the amount. My eyes scanned the list and my breath caught. It was one thing to remember the loans. It was another to see the daily casual pilfering. Cafe Nero, £8.75. I never went to Cafe Nero. Uber trip, $14.50. I hadn't been in a taxi in years. Prime Video subscription, $7.99. I didn't know what Prime Video was. It was a constant, low-level drain, like 1,000 tiny barnacles clinging to the hull of a ship. "Is there a way," I asked, keeping my voice level, "to get a copy of this for my records?" "Absolutely," he said. He showed me how to download the monthly statements as PDF files, neat and official, identical to the ones that used to come in the post. He helped me create a folder on the desktop, a little yellow icon, and I named it simply Household Accounts. Then he showed me the most powerful tool of all. You can set up alerts, he explained. The bank can send you a text message or an email anytime there's a transaction. You can even set a limit so it only tells you about purchases over, say, £20. My heart gave a great, powerful leap. A watchdog, an alarm bell that would ring the moment a hand went into the cookie jar. "Show me," I said, my voice tight. We set it up together, linking it to my simple pay-as-you-go mobile, an alert for any transaction over £20, a digital tripwire. After Alex left, refusing payment and accepting only another cup of tea, I sat alone in the growing twilight, the screen illuminating my face. I opened the household accounts folder. I began to download the statements, going back month by month, then year by year. It was a grim archaeology. I cross-referenced the digital entries with the handwritten ones in my ledger. They matched, but the screen told a more detailed story. I found the charge for the airline tickets to Bali on Jessica's statement, confirming the lie of her boutique. I found a string of purchases from an expensive men's clothier charged to a card of mine that Leo had borrowed for petrol money 3 months ago and never returned. I worked for hours, downloading, saving, renaming each file with the month and year. I created subfolders, Leo unauthorized, Jessica unauthorized. The evidence mounted, a silent, damning collection of digital footprints they never thought I'd learn how to follow. The old dear was building a case. The librarian was creating a bibliography of her own exploitation. The folder was no longer just for accounts, it was my dossier, and it was growing heavier and more irrefutable with every click of the mouse. Evidence is a cold, hard thing. It has no emotion, no agenda, it simply is. My handbag felt unusually heavy that morning as I walked down Elm Street. Inside, tucked beside my wallet, was Arthur's ledger and a small gray USB drive that Alex had given me. They were the sum of my new, terrible knowledge, a compact archive of betrayal. The solicitor's office was in a converted Victorian house, its brick facade painted a respectable dark green. A small brass plaque read Davies' Son Solicitors. It looked solid, dependable. I prayed it was. Taking that first step, looking up the number for a solicitor who specialized in elder law, my finger tracing the advertisement in the local paper, had been the hardest part. It felt like a final admission of failure, a declaration that my family was broken beyond my ability to repair it. But the memory of my children's voices from the speaker was a merciless spur, driving me forward past the point of return. A receptionist led me to a quiet office at the back of the house, overlooking a tidy garden. The room was lined with books, just like Arthur's study, but these were thick legal volumes, not histories of forgotten wars. Mr. Davies stood as I entered. He was a man perhaps a decade younger than me, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and a reassuringly calm demeanor. There was no pity in his gaze, only a quiet, professional attention that immediately put me at ease. "Mrs. Vance," he said, gesturing to a comfortable leather chair opposite his large mahogany desk, "thank you for coming in. How can I help you?" For a moment, the words caught in my throat. It is one thing to know your own story, it is another to speak it aloud to a stranger. I took a breath, reached into my handbag, and placed the ledger and the USB drive on his desk. It started with small things, I began, my voice a little unsteady. But I have come to believe my children are taking advantage of me. I told him everything. I didn't cry. The time for tears was over. With a librarian's methodical precision, I laid out the facts as I had recorded them. The loan for the Phantom Boutique, the steady pattern of financial requests that were never repaid, the missing heirlooms, the overheard phone call, which I recounted nearly verbatim, my memory for their cold words seared into my mind. I watched his face as I spoke, but his expression remained one of serene, unwavering focus. He did not interrupt. He simply listened, making the occasional note on a yellow legal pad. The act of being heard, truly and completely, without judgment or placation, was like a balm on a wound I didn't know was still open. When I finished, I fell silent. The ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall was the only sound. Mr. Davies put down his pen. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "thank you for your clarity. What you have been describing has a name. It is called undue influence, and it is a form of elder abuse." He said the word abuse, and the world shifted on its axis. It was a word from news reports, from pamphlets in a doctor's waiting room. It was not a word I had ever associated with my own life, with my own children. But hearing it spoken by this calm, rational man, it fit. It was the key that unlocked the entire puzzle. I wasn't a difficult mother or a forgetful woman. I was a victim. A few years ago, I confessed, the shame rising in me. After a bad case of the flu, Leo had me sign a power of attorney. He said it was so he could manage my bills if I ever became incapacitated. It sounded so responsible at the time. Mr. Davies nodded slowly. A common tactic. It is presented as an act of care, but it grants them significant legal access to your finances. The good news is, as long as you have capacity, which you very clearly do, we can revoke it immediately. He spent the next hour outlining a plan. He spoke not of vengeance, but of protection, not of punishment, but of boundaries. He was a cartographer, drawing a map out of the wilderness they had created for me. First, the power of attorney would be revoked. A formal notice would be sent to every one of my financial institutions. Second, we would open new accounts at a completely different bank, a place my children had no knowledge of, and begin transferring my assets. Third, he advised me on securing my home. "The locks," he said, looking at me directly, "they must be changed. This house is your property. You have the absolute right to decide who can and cannot enter it." He slid the USB drive into his computer. As my meticulously organized files appeared on his screen, a flicker of something, respect perhaps, crossed his face. "This is excellent, Mrs. Vance," he murmured, clicking through the downloaded statements. "You've done the hard work already. This makes everything much more straightforward." I left his office an hour later, stepping back out into the bright afternoon sunlight. The street looked the same, but I was different. The weight in my handbag was gone, replaced by a folder of documents and a clear three-step plan. The shame that had been my constant companion had receded, replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. I had a solicitor. I had a plan. And for the first time in a very long time, I had a clear and unobstructed view of the future, my future. The week after my consultation with Mr. Davies was the quietest, busiest week of my life. On the surface, nothing changed. I tended my roses, I did my shopping, I spoke to my children when they called. But beneath that placid surface, I was a general waging a silent campaign. My kitchen table was no longer for tea and biscuits, it was my war room. My first move was to become a financial phantom. On Tuesday morning, I took a bus to the next town over, a place where no one knew my face. The bank Mr. Davies had recommended, Cumberland Trust, was an unassuming building of gray stone, its name etched discreetly in the glass. Inside, it was hushed and deeply serious. I met with a woman named Mrs. Albright, the trust manager. And sure enough, an hour later, my phone rang again. It was him. Mom, Jess just called me. She said you sold Dad's portfolio. What's going on? Why didn't you talk to me first? His voice was a slick veneer of hurt concern, but underneath it, I could hear the frantic whirring of his mind. The Bank of Mom was showing signs of a capital crisis, and it was threatening his bottom line. There was nothing to talk about, Leo, I said calmly. It was my decision. But that was for your future, for emergencies, he protested. His emergencies, he meant, the new car he was planning to ask for. Well, I said, looking out the window at the roses, their petals tight and resolute against the coming evening chill. This felt like a necessary time to access it. He didn't know what to say. His script, the one where he played the responsible son managing his slightly dotty mother's affairs, had no lines for this. I had gone off book. I could hear the panic tightening his voice as he tried to regain control, asking probing questions about my expenses, about my pension, about whether I had made any big purchases lately. He was no longer worried about my well-being. He was conducting an audit. I gave him vague, reassuring answers, letting him believe that the well was indeed beginning to run dry. When I hung up the phone, I felt a grim, cold satisfaction. They believed they were seeing the whole picture, a landscape of dwindling resources. They had no idea that 90% of the map was hidden from them in a quiet trust in a neighboring town, secure behind a wall of legal fire. They were circling a drying puddle, oblivious to the deep, secret ocean just over the horizon. Their greed, I realized, was the most predictable thing about them, and I was finally learning how to use it. The scent of roasting chicken has always been the scent of Sunday. For 40 years, it has filled this house, a weekly ritual of comfort and continuity. But as I basted the skin with melted butter and herbs, the familiar aroma felt different. It was the smell of a final act, the stage dressing for a carefully managed goodbye. Today, I was playing the role of the mother they remembered one last time. The slightly frail, endlessly accommodating woman whose love was a resource to be tapped. It was a role I knew by heart and one I intended to play to perfection before I burned the costume and walked off the stage for good. They arrived together, which was unusual. It was a united front. Jessica came in first, bestowing a papery kiss on my cheek that smelled of expensive perfume. "Mom, you shouldn't have gone to all this trouble," she said, her eyes scanning the table, already assessing the effort. Leo followed, carrying a bottle of wine he would leave half-finished for me to deal with later. He gave my shoulder a squeeze that was meant to feel like a hug. "You look tired, Mom," he said, his brow furrowed with a performance of concern. "Are you sure you're up for this?" The performance had begun. They were here not for a meal, but for a reconnaissance mission. The news of the liquidated stocks had spooked them, and they needed to survey the landscape before launching their planned assault for the car loan. We sat at the dining table, the same table where I had cut their birthday cakes and helped them with their homework. The light from the setting sun slanted across the polished wood, illuminating the faint scratches and dents, a map of our shared history. For a while, the conversation was a passable imitation of family life. Jessica talked about a brand collaboration that was almost finalized. Leo complained about a difficult client. I listened, I nodded, I murmured the appropriate words of encouragement. But I wasn't really there. I was watching them from a great, clear distance, as if through a sheet of flawless glass. For the first time, I saw the mechanics of their manipulation with absolute clarity. I saw how Jessica would introduce a problem, the rising rent on her flat, the cost of equipment for her online presence, and then trail off, leaving a silence in the conversation that I was conditioned to fill with an offer of help. I saw how Leo would praise me for my prudence, my good sense with money, before mentioning a bill he was struggling to pay. It was a dance, a carefully choreographed routine they had perfected over years, and I had always been their willing, witless partner. "It's this car, you know," Leo said, swirling the wine in his glass. He sighed, a sound heavy with manufactured weariness. "It's just not reliable. I was late to a client meeting the other day. It could have cost me the contract." He looked at me, his eyes wide and earnest. "I worry about being on the motorway in that thing. It's a death trap." Jessica dutifully picked up her cue. She placed her fork down with a delicate clink. "I worry about you constantly, Leo," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Every time you drive it, we just want you to be safe." She turned her gaze to me, her lower lip quivering almost imperceptibly. It was a masterful performance. They were perfectly in sync, playing on my maternal fears with the precision of concert violinists. In the past, my heart would have ached. I would have seen only my struggling son, my worried daughter. I would have immediately started calculating, figuring out how I could stretch my resources to solve this latest problem. But now, all I could hear was the echo of their voices from the Bluetooth speaker. "Well, corner the old dear after Sunday dinner. She's always softer then." I took a slow sip of water. I let the silence stretch, feeling its weight. I watched the hope and expectation bloom on their faces. They thought they had me. The hook was set. "Oh dear," I said finally, my voice soft and tired. "That does sound very worrying." I offered them more roast potatoes. I changed the subject to the weather. I played the part of a woman who was concerned, but also overwhelmed, perhaps a little confused, the woman they believed me to be. Their confusion was a visible thing. They exchanged a quick, frustrated glance. This was not how the scene was supposed to play out. I was supposed to offer a solution. The Bank of Mom was supposed to open its vaults. I let them stumble, forcing them to improvise. They circled back to the topic twice more, their attempts growing more clumsy and transparent each time. When they left, their hugs were a little tighter, their expressions of concern a little more strained. They were leaving empty-handed, but with the belief that the door was still open, that the slightly senile old dear was just having an off day and would come around with a little more pressure. They had no idea they were walking out of my life for the last time as they knew it. I stood at the kitchen sink long after they were gone, washing the dishes by hand. The house was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't empty, it was clear. I had watched the architects of my unhappiness lay out their blueprints one final time, and I had felt nothing but the calm, steady certainty of the walls I was about to build. This dinner wasn't just a meal. It was an epilogue to one life and the quiet preface to another. I slept soundly for the first time in months. There were no ghosts in my dreams, no anxieties whispering at the edge of my consciousness. I woke with the dawn, feeling a profound and unfamiliar sense of calm. He showed me how the new lock worked. I put the key in. It slid in with a smooth, firm precision that the old, worn lock had lacked for years. I turned it. The deadbolt shot across with a deep, resonant thunk. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a boundary being drawn, the sound of a door becoming a door again, and not just a suggestion. It was the sound of no. I went to the small dish on the hall table, the one where I used to leave my keys. Inside were the old ones, the ones I had given to Leo and Jessica years ago, copies they had probably made copies of. They looked flimsy now, impotent. I picked them up. They were still warm from the ambient heat of the house. I had given them these keys with love, believing that love meant unfettered access, a home that was always open to them. I saw now that true love also requires doors and the dignity to knock before entering. I went back to George, who was packing up his tools. I opened my hand and showed him the old keys. "What do you do with these?" I asked. "Whatever you like," he said with a shrug. "Most people just chuck them." I didn't want to just throw them away. I wanted a ceremony. I wanted to hand them over, to formally relinquish them. "Would you take them?" I asked. "Dispose of them for me?" He looked at me for a long moment, a flicker of understanding in his kind eyes. He took the keys from my palm, his rough, calloused hand closing around them. "Consider it done," he said gently. I paid him, and he handed me the small plastic bag with my 2 new keys. My keys, the only keys. As his van pulled away from the curb, I stood in my open doorway. I closed the door, slid my new key into the lock, and turned the tumbler. The solid sunk echoed in the sudden, complete silence of the house. It was a full stop at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. And in that moment, I felt a peace so profound, it was as if I could finally, after all these years, take a full and proper breath. I knew they would come. Their performance on Sunday had failed to yield results, and their anxiety over my perceived financial decline would not allow them to wait long. I was sitting in the living room on Tuesday morning, reading, when I saw Leo's car pull up to the curb. Jessica was in the passenger seat. They were here to escalate, to apply the pressure they felt had been lacking. "This is insane," he sputtered, shaking the papers at me. This is a joke." "I assure you it is not," I replied, my voice devoid of the anger he was clearly expecting. There was no rage left, only a vast, clear-eyed calm. "You will no longer be using my home as your office, your storage unit, or your personal bank. You will not be entering this house again without a direct and explicit invitation from me." Jessica started to cry. It was the performance I had seen 100 times, the shimmering tears, the trembling lip. But for the first time, it had no effect on me. The strings to that particular puppet had been cut. "Mom, how could you?" she sobbed. "After everything we've been through, we're your family." "Family," I said, and the word tasted like ash in my mouth. Family does not lie. Family does not steal from a mother who has given them everything. Family does not mock her behind her back and call her senile while planning how to fleece her for a new car. The color drained from both their faces. The mention of the car was a direct hit, a confirmation that their most secret conversation had been heard. The last of their bluster evaporated, replaced by a raw, ugly panic. "This is my home now," I said, my voice as solid as the new lock behind me. "My money, my life. The arrangements we had before are over. This is the new arrangement." I looked at them one last time. My beautiful, broken children, strangers who had been living in my house for years. I felt a pang of loss, not for them as they were, but for the memory of the small hands I once held, the children I had loved without reservation. But that grief was a phantom limb. The part that felt had already been amputated. Without another word, I turned, stepped back inside, and closed the door. I did not lock it immediately. I leaned my back against the cool, solid wood and listened. I heard their shocked whispers, then the rustle of paper as they, no doubt, reread the damning figures. Then came the anger, Leo's voice raised, Jessica's sobs turning shrill. I heard my name spat like a curse. I stood there and listened to the wreckage, the sound of a world ending. Then I reached out, turned the deadbolt, and walked away from the door. It has been 6 weeks since the meeting on the front porch. The silence in this house has changed its texture. It used to be a silence of anticipation, a held breath waiting for the next phone call, the next unannounced arrival, the next manufactured crisis.